We're going to start our first section here on our coverage of photosynthesis, which in Biology 1200 should be chapter 5 in the textbook. So this is kind of the plan that we're going to look at with this chapter. We're going to start off with a quick intro of sort of how life on Earth, for the most part, relies on photosynthesis to sustain itself. Primarily, we've seen this before, but sunlight is the main thing that supports most life on Earth, and so we have to have a way for at least some organisms to capture that energy for themselves, but also for everybody else that depends on sunlight that's been processed by those organisms. From there, we'll kind of go into the physics of this a little bit, how sunlight actually behaves as a type of energy, as well as how what photosynthetic pigments are and how they contribute to the process of photosynthesis. We'll go back and talk about what chloroplasts are. We saw this back in a previous chapter, but the structure of chloroplasts is very important to the overall function of photosynthesis. You can't have the function without the structure, so we have that as well. We have the actual process of photosynthesis. This fourth bullet point here will be very much a summary sort of a thing, but then we'll move into a little bit more descriptive treatment of the light reactions and dark reactions of photosynthesis. So basically what happens is photosynthesis is divided up into two main segments. The first one is one that relies on light directly to kind of drive the process. The other one is one that relies on light indirectly, but uses the energy captured in the light to actually produce carbohydrates. And one of those, of course, would be glucose. From there, we're going to go ahead and talk about some different alternative pathways for photosynthesis. We call C4 pathways and CAM pathways. These are primarily used by plants that live in places that are very, very dry, places where your typical average kind of entry-level base model photosynthesis wouldn't work real well. Plants have evolved a variety of ways to get around the limitations, especially of having limited water. And that will kind of wrap up the chapter. So this is a bit of a review. We've seen this before. We've talked about how most life on Earth, 99% of life on Earth probably relies on sunlight capture in order to have the energy that's required to fuel the properties of life. Most organisms aren't able to capture sunlight directly. A few of them are. And so for those that are, they become a very, very important part of the ecosystem in capturing that very important energy and making it available for other organisms to use. This is our overall equation for photosynthesis. We can simplify this a little bit. If we take this equation and subtract 6 water molecules from each side, so if we take 6 water molecules away from this side, we're going to have 6 H2Os. If we take 6 H2Os away from this side, we'll just have nothing there. So then our reaction would actually become 6 CO2 plus 6 water gives us a glucose, and then 6 oxygen. Right? And of course, this also has to involve sunlight. You can't have any of this happening without the sunlight. These are very low energy reactants. The glucose, especially, is a very high energy product. And as we know, we can't create energy, so energy has to have come in. There has to have been energy input somewhere into this thing to make these low energy reactants into higher energy product. And so it's an endergonic reaction, and the energy from this reaction comes from the sun. For the most part, the organisms that do this process, most of the ones that we're going to talk about plants, so that would be your terrestrial kind of land-dwelling plants, this last group. But there are other organisms which can do photosynthesis. Blue-green bacteria, which are prokaryotes but can still do photosynthesis even without a chloroplast, they are able to do photosynthesis. We also have algae, right? So different types of algae, from brown algae, red algae, green algae, they are also able to do photosynthesis and harvest the energy of the sun to produce carbohydrates. So they're another group which is able to be photosynthetic. But primarily in this chapter, we're going to be dealing with plants. Now, this slide, I think, really nicely shows us the relationship between mitochondria and chloroplasts. What goes into one comes out and becomes the product, or becomes the reactants for the other one. So we focus on chloroplasts, which are doing photosynthesis. Chloroplasts, basically, during photosynthesis, make 3 things. They make some ATP, they make some glucose, sugar, and they make some oxygen. And so by doing that, this sugar and this oxygen become reactants for cellular respiration, which is going to be in the next chapter, which is where we're going to turn glucose now also into ATP, but then into CO2 and water, and then CO2 and water become reactants again for the chloroplast. So these reactants eventually become products for the next organelle, which then creates products which are the reactants for the next organelle, and it kind of cycles back and forth. The only thing that's not cycling back and forth is energy, because as we've seen, converting energy from one form to another is going to cost us a certain amount of energy in the form of heat. So energy has to always be coming in from the sun. This is a constant energy input sort of a thing. For the most part, everything else in here, except for the ATP, is going to be recycled. And so again, I want you to remember that plants have both mitochondria and chloroplasts. It would do the plants no good to be able to make glucose in their chloroplasts unless they have a mitochondria or something like it to break the glucose down into ATP. It's a very critical thing that those plants also have mitochondria. All right, the next step is we're going to look at energy in the form of sunlight, and sunlight is a type of electromagnetic energy. It has several different components. The components of sunlight that come in have different wavelengths. So if you think about a wave, which if I kind of draw it sort of here with this arrow, I can kind of do, actually let's see if I can do this. If we do a wave like this, right, so that's a really bad drawing, but this distance here on this wave is the wavelength. All right, so the length of the wave is very predictive of how much energy it has and also how much energy can be contributed to something like photosynthesis. This would be one that has a relatively long wave. If we take a different type of energy, we could take one like this maybe. And so this is a much shorter and very awkward type of way to draw waves. This wavelength here would be substantially shorter. All right, so the other thing to think about here is when you have wavelengths that are different, the other thing that's going to differ is how much energy is carried by those waves. So the general rule of thumb here is, again, if I try to draw this, I'm not sure how well I can do this, but if I draw this like a graph here and here, if we take the energy of the wave, so I'm going to E here, we take the energy of the wave and compare that to the wavelength, what we can find is that the energy and wavelength are inversely proportional. So the longer the wave, the less energy it has. The shorter the wave, the more energy it has. Okay, and so we can find wavelengths coming in for all different sizes, all different energies from the sun. We'll look at a few of them here in a second. But this is a really important relationship. The longer the wave, the less energy it has. The shorter the wave, the more energy it has. Okay, so the pigment molecules are the things in the leaves that are capable of capturing certain wavelengths of light with certain amounts of energy and allowing them to feed into the process of photosynthesis. Light is a type of kinetic energy. It consists of photons. Photons are little discrete bundles or packets of light that contain energy that can be captured by things like pigments. And so these photons, as they come in and ideally are absorbed by the pigments in a leaf, these photons can then pass off their energy to these pigments, which then cause their electrons to kind of do different things, and that kind of kicks off the beginning of the photosynthetic process. Right? This is the same as what I was saying in that previous graph, but the energy content of the photon is inversely proportional to its wave. Again, it's a really fancy way of saying that really long waves have really low energy, and really short waves have really high energy. So it's kind of the opposite. Depending on the wavelength versus energy, there's kind of this opposite relationship. All right, so this is essentially representing all sunlight coming in. And you can filter this down to different types of energy in the sunlight. The part that we can see with the naked eye is this very, very narrow section right here. And if you guys ever have heard of Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, cyan we're not going to worry about, but red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet is Roy G. Biv. Really good way to remember that. A lot of that part of the spectrum is exactly the same thing that plants can use. They like the red stuff. They like the blue stuff. They don't like a lot of the stuff in between, and we'll get to that more here in a couple of minutes. But on this graph, the thing I want to show you is that there are lots of other kinds of energy that we can't see with our eyes and energy that plants cannot capture with their chloroplasts. So the really, really, really super short wavelength stuff, those are gamma rays. These are also really high energy, and fortunately for us, and fortunately for plants, we don't see those too often on the surface of the Earth because they're extremely hazardous to the health of living things. X-rays, honestly, aren't a whole lot better. They're not quite as high energy. They're a little bit longer wavelength. Certainly they have enough energy to penetrate your body, so which is why we use them to take pictures of broken bones and whatnot, is because these photons can pass through our body, and depending on how they pass through different tissues, they can then be photographed and therefore give you an image of the tissue that you're looking at. UV light, which is even longer wave, but even shorter energy. Again, UV light, you probably know, is not terribly a good thing for you to have a lot of. UV light is not so powerful or so energetic that it can go all the way through your body, but it can penetrate your skin cells. And if that photon of UV light penetrates a skin cell, there's a chance at least that it might also hit a piece of DNA, which could then induce a mutation, which is why we worry about overexposure to sunlight and skin cancer and those kinds of things. We've got visible light, which is kind of the primary focus of what we're dealing with. We've got infrared, which is essentially heat, microwaves, radio waves. Those are really, really, really long waves that have really, really, really low energy. So they're not going to be too harmful to the health of living things, but also not all that useful for plants to do photosynthesis. Okay, so when photons of light come in from the sun, there is one of about three things that can happen, right? So either that photon of light could pass right through the leaf. If the photon is too high energy, it's going to pass through the leaf and not really do a whole lot for photosynthesis. UV light would do that. It would pass through the leaf, transmit through it, and therefore the energy would not be absorbed from that particular photon of light. It could also bounce off the leaf. If it doesn't have the right amount of energy for chlorophyll, that photon of light could also bounce off the leaf and then also not be available for absorption. But for that ideal range of wavelengths of light, the perfect length, the perfect energy, those can be absorbed by chlorophyll. And when chlorophyll's electrons absorb energy, those electrons are going to get excited. Right? So think about what we talked about back in our chapter on chemistry. Electrons' energy levels can change. You can add energy to them, you can take energy away, it can go both ways. And so if a photon of light hits an electron in, say, chlorophyll, that electron's energy level is going to go up, and that electron actually will leave from the chlorophyll molecule. Okay, so the electrons get excited by energy, they leave chlorophyll, they go off to do something else. Right? So with the different types of pigment molecules, and again, pigments are chemicals that can absorb photons of light, there is a particular range that those chemicals like the most. The absorption spectrum is the part of visible light that pigments are able to capture efficiently. Okay, so we'll look at the absorption spectra here in a second for things like chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and carotenoids. All right, so that's kind of our first mention of different types of pigments specifically. For what we're going to say right now, chlorophyll A is kind of the main star of our show. With all this talk of photosynthesis, chlorophyll A is the star of the show. It's the main player in all of this. Chlorophyll B and carotenoids, those are both kind of like supporting actors and actresses. They're not really going to do anything directly to do photosynthesis, but they can help chlorophyll A do its part of photosynthesis. All right, so if we focus on this green line right here, this bright green line, there's a peak absorption for chlorophyll A right around the kind of purplish blue part of the visible spectrum, and a secondary peak out here in the orange to red part of the visible spectrum. Okay, so we have these two peaks for chlorophyll A. Chlorophyll B has an offset peak. It's a little bit more blue, and much higher actually than chlorophyll A is, and then a secondary peak down in the orange range. And then for carotenoids, they really like the blue to light blue almost into the green. This yellow line in the carotenoids almost into the green range for them. That's the part of the spectrum they like. Now what you'll notice is there's not a lot of absorption here in the yellow to green to light orange part of the spectrum. And so what that means, if yellow and green are not absorbed, if red is, and blue is, and violet is, if those are absorbed, they're not able to bounce off the leaf. But green and yellow are not absorbed, so they are able to bounce off the leaf. And if this light comes into your eye is going to perceive green because those are the wavelengths that are being reflected. There are green wavelengths being reflected, so that's what your eye perceives as being green. This is the reason why plants look green, at least in the summer and spring, is because their pigments are bouncing off green and yellow light. That light then enters into our eye, and our brain perceives that as being green. Now, if you think about something like a carotenoid, carotenoids kind of end here, sort of the light blue part of the spectrum, and they don't absorb anything out past that. They drop off completely. So for them, it's no yellow, no orange, no red. Carotenoids tend to appear to be either orange or yellow, typically. So carotenoids are the ones, they're also helpers. They're in the leaves all the time. If you look outside right now in nice spring, summer kinds of weather, the leaves are green, but there are pigments there. Other pigments there. There's carotenoids, there's some orange, there's some yellow, there's some red in there as well that you can't see because there is so much chlorophyll. Right? There's a little bit of carotenoid, there is a ton of chlorophyll, so the leaves take on the appearance of that chlorophyll. Now in the fall, when the leaves change color, what's going on there is that chlorophyll is being reabsorbed by the plant because chlorophyll is a very expensive molecule to make. And so as you take the chlorophyll out of the leaves, what you're left with is the orange and yellow stuff. The carotenoids are left behind. Even chlorophyll B sometimes can be left behind, but those really bright oranges and yellows and reds are what show up because all of a sudden all the green stuff is gone. The orange and yellow stuff is there right now, but the green covers it up because there's so much of that green. But if you take the green away, then all of a sudden you can start to see the orange and yellow and red kind of stuff popping up. And so that's actually why leaves change color. A little more specific now on the pigments. Chlorophyll A, like I said, is the main pigment. This is the only one that can start off photosynthesis. This is the only one that can start what we call the light reactions of photosynthesis. So it's a really, really important player. The others, chlorophyll B, is an accessory pigment, which means it's a helper. It's one that by itself cannot do photosynthesis or initiate photosynthesis, but it can contribute. So what chlorophyll B does is it will help capture photons of light that chlorophyll A didn't capture, and it will funnel or pass those photons of light onto chlorophyll A. So it captures them, can't do anything directly with them, but what it can do is pass them off to chlorophyll A, like a relay race sort of a thing. So again, chlorophyll A's electrons get excited, they leave chlorophyll A, they go off into the world and they do some stuff. All right, next step, we're going to go back and take a look at the chloroplast, review the structure of chloroplast, because that's going to be really important in looking at the different parts of the photosynthetic pathway. Before we look at chloroplast directly, though, we're going to go back and take a quick look at the shape of your kind of average, everyday sort of a leaf. If there is such a thing, leaves tend to be very flat and very thin, except for things like pine trees and spruce trees and fir trees, which live in cold places where having rounder needles is actually more efficient. Most plants in most part of the world have very flat, very thin leaves. And so what that does, we've seen issues with surface area and volume before, but by having a very thin shape, very thin sort of a structure, they can absorb maximum sunlight, they can absorb maximum CO2, and both of those two things are very good to do if you're trying to do photosynthesis as a plant. The drawback to having very flat, very thin leaves is it also makes you very, very, very able to lose water, and that's not such a good thing if you're a plant, but we'll get back to that. The part of the leaf on the upper and lower surface, in this picture it's these grayish cells. These guys are what we call epidermal cells. They are colorless cells. They do not do photosynthesis. They typically don't even have any chloroplasts, but they're very important cells for providing a layer of protection outside the plant, as well as to help minimize evaporation outside the plant. So the epidermal cells are very important too. There is a cuticle, like we talked about on our chapter with the chemistry stuff. So the cuticle is a layer of wax on the outside of the leaf to help seal off it against water loss. You know, typically in our everyday lives, we tend to think of wanting to waterproof things as keeping water out. Plants are trying to waterproof things and keep water in. So the cuticle, the layer of wax on the outside of the leaf, helps them to conserve water and keep water in and minimize dehydration to the extent possible. The layers of cells in between the epidermal cells and the cuticle, these are mesophyll cells, and there are different types. These cells up here are called palisade mesophyll cells or palisade parenchyma because they're tall and skinny. These guys down here are called spongy mesophyll because they're kind of less dense. They're spread out more. So that would be your spongy mesophyll. All right, so in the leaf, most of the leaf that does the photosynthesis is these cells, the mesophyll cells. These guys have most of the chloroplasts inside this leaf. Epidermal cells are transparent. They're clear. They allow light to penetrate through on both sides. This is a vein here. The veins help transport things inside the leaf, but also to different parts of the plant. So through the branches, through the twigs, to the stem, the veins help to do that as well. The last thing to look at here on this particular picture is what are called stomata, which also in this picture they're labeled stoma. Stoma and stomata are the same thing. They are openings, kind of like pores, to the outside world. And this is where the bulk of your gas exchange happens. This is where CO2 goes in. This is where O2 comes out of the leaf. So again, CO2 goes in, O2 comes out. The stomata or the stoma are also where water evaporates outside of the leaf. Because again, most of the leaf is sealed off with wax. So you want to be able to have some degree of interaction with the outside climate. Having these stomata allow the plants to allow things in or out and minimize evaporation kind of at the same time. So we're allowing for some exchange there through the stomata. All right, the chloroplasts themselves, and again, this should be reviewed because we've seen this before in our chapter on cells, but for a typical average kind of mesophyll cell, especially these long skinny guys up here, it would not be unusual or unexpected to find maybe 40 to 200 chloroplasts per cell. That would not be out of the question at all. The little green discs inside the chloroplasts are called thylakoids. So these green discs are thylakoids, and each one of those thylakoids also has a membrane, a phospholipid bilayer, just like you find outside in the plasma membrane, but these are now inside the chloroplast. Right? So we have thylakoid membranes. We have membranes around the chloroplast itself, both outer and inner. And these pigment molecules that we talked about before, your chlorophyll A, your chlorophyll B, your carotenoids, those pigment molecules are located within the thylakoid membranes. They're actually built into this membrane. The green disc, this layer of yellow that you see is the thylakoid membrane. That is where you're going to find your pigments. And these pigments are clustered into photosystems, which we'll see a bit later. But photosystems are what essentially kick off the early stages of photosynthesis. Okay, the next step, really broad kind of summary of what photosynthesis is, what it looks like, how it works. There's two main parts to photosynthesis. I think, like I mentioned before in this section, there are the light-dependent reactions, which is where we use sunlight. Like we do this, animals. Plants use sunlight. They capture that sunlight, and they're going to use that to create some ATP and a molecule called NADPH. All right, so ATP and NADPH you can think of as being fuel molecules. Okay, so they are the end result of the light-dependent reactions. We've seen before how ATP gets made. ADP plus phosphate gives us ATP, and again, that is an endergonic reaction. It requires energy. Breaking down the ATP is going to yield us some ADP and some phosphate, which is an exergonic reaction. But this guy over here, we haven't really seen too much yet. So what I'm going to try to do here is I'm going to try to draw a little equation here on the screen to show us how that might work. Okay, so we're going to take a molecule called Na. Wow, this is awkward. Na D P. Wow. Plus. All right, so NADP plus an H plus. It's got to be better to do this. H plus. So what we're creating here basically is an electron carrier. All right, so these are molecules that are able to carry electrons and energy around inside of a cell. This particular one is going to carry 2 electrons. And what this is going to do is going to yield us the end result of this. Those are the reactants. The product of this is going to be the NADPH, which I guess I could have just put an arrow up to the actual part on the screen, but I didn't think of that, so I'm just going to stick this out and try to make it happen. So we're making NADP. It's better P that time. Okay, we're getting better. H. Oops. NADPH, which is, again, a type of fuel that's going to be used to drive the second set of reactions. Okay, so ATP and NADPH become the fuel molecules to make the next set of reactions go. All right, so the second set of reactions, and so this is a bit confusing sometimes because the next set of reactions actually has like a bunch of different names you can call it, and all of them are correct. You can call them the carbon reactions or the carbon fixation reactions. That's perfectly acceptable to do that because this is where CO2 gives up some carbon, and that carbon then becomes part of glucose. So we're actually capturing carbon now and using that to produce glucose, which, again, the carbohydrates, the main reason why we do photosynthesis in the first place. We're going to use ATP and NADPH to produce glucose from the CO2 molecules that are coming in. Now, these molecules require energy, right? The fuel up here, the ATP, the NADPH, are the fuel molecules used to drive the carbon reactions. Okay, and so the carbon reactions can be called the carbon reactions. They can be called the light-independent reactions, which kind of is the other alternative up here to light-dependent. These are the light-independent reactions. You can call this the Calvin cycle. A guy by the name of Melvin Calvin, which is a really unfortunate name. A guy by the name of Melvin Calvin discovered this process a really long time ago, so they're called the Calvin cycle. You can call this C3 reactions, because as we'll see here in a few minutes or in the next section, there are going to be some 3 carbon molecules involved with doing this. You can also call it the dark reactions, and I saved that one for last because I tend to call this process the dark reactions. That's how I learned it, but you got to be really careful if you say dark reactions or light independent reactions because it kind of makes it sound like you don't need light at all. And in reality, you don't need light directly, but what you do need is the product from the light reactions. If you take a plant in the sunlight doing light reactions, it's making glucose, it's perfectly happy, it's giving off O2, it's using up CO2, it's using up water. If you take that plant and put it in the dark, the light reactions stop almost instantaneously. Like a second or two later, the light reactions stop. If the light reactions stop, and if you stop making your ATP and your NADPH, then the dark reactions stop. Because if you don't have this stuff here, the light reactions producing ATP and NADPH, then you can't have the carbon fixation reaction. So even though you don't technically need light directly for this to work, you do very much indirectly need light for these reactions to proceed the way they're supposed to. You need the indirect products of light to make this work. All right, this picture is kind of scary, but we're going to end with this for this section. I'm going to kind of walk through this and show you, this kind of summarizes everything we've seen so far. we have up here, this is a single thylakoid. This is just one of these green discs over here in this chloroplast. This is one of those green discs. Now it has a phospholipid bilayer. You can see heads and tails, tails and heads. We've got a phospholipid bilayer. There are photosystems, and again, photosystems consist of pigment molecules like chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, carotenoids. All those guys are packed into these two photosystems. This is also where we're going to see water being used and O2 being produced. In the thylakoids is where water gets used and O2 gets produced. That all happens within the thylakoid, right? All that happens within the thylakoid. Outside the thylakoid, around those little green discs, is a space called the stroma. Now, stoma, which are the openings to the outside world, and stroma, which is a fluid-filled space outside the thylakoids, two very, very different things. They're not even remotely close to being the same thing. They sound very similar, they're spelled very similar, but don't let that confuse you. They're not the same thing. Stoma and stroma are two very different things. Okay, out here in the stroma, we're going to use our two fuel molecules, the ATP and the NADPH, to drive the Calvin cycle. Right? As the Calvin cycle proceeds, it needs more ATP and more NADPH. These two fuel molecules come from the light reactions. They're driven by sunlight. As long as we're going to keep cranking through this Calvin cycle, we got to have fuel. Because the Calvin cycle represents a series of endergonic reactions that need energy that comes in from these two. All right, this is also, by the way, where we use CO2 to kind of make this happen. So the carbons here become part of these organic molecules, aka sugar, aka glucose, that are eventually going to come out of this. All right, so this is a good place to take a break. I will cut this section off here, and I will pick up with the next section here momentarily.